Angela Morris, a highly successful black CEO, was no stranger to airports. Over the years, she had traveled to countless cities for important meetings, conferences, and business deals. She was used to walking through terminals quietly, never drawing too much attention to herself. Angela preferred simplicity. Despite her wealth and status, she dressed modestly and carried herself with calm confidence rather than flash or arrogance. On this evening, she was scheduled to fly to another city for a major meeting the following morning. She had purchased a first-class ticket, as she always did for long flights, since it gave her comfort and space to prepare for the work ahead. Angela arrived at the airport well in advance, carrying only a slim laptop bag on her shoulder and her phone in her hand. She didn't travel with an entourage, nor did she wear expensive jewelry or designer brands. She preferred comfort and practicality. As she walked toward the gate, her mind was already half on her meeting. She rehearsed talking points in her head, reminding herself of the key decisions she needed to make once she landed. She had spent years building her company and earning respect in the corporate world, but she never forgot her humble beginnings. When she reached the counter to confirm her boarding pass and seat, she greeted the gate attendants with a polite smile. "Good evening. I'm checking in for my first-class seat on this flight," she said warmly, sliding her phone across the counter with her digital ticket displayed. The young attendant behind the desk glanced at her briefly, then quickly shifted her eyes away as though Angela did not belong there. Without even scanning the ticket properly, the attendant said in a dismissive tone, "This line is for first-class passengers only. You need to go check at the economy desk." Angela paused, taken aback by the coldness in the woman's voice. She kept her composure and replied gently, "This is my first-class ticket. Could you please check the confirmation number?" The attendant didn't hide her impatience. With a sigh, she scanned the ticket, but her expression didn't change. She gestured toward another counter and said, "I don't think this is valid for first class. Please try the other line." Angela remained calm, but she could feel the eyes of other passengers nearby. Some people in the waiting area had overheard the exchange. A couple of them frowned, sensing something was wrong, but no one spoke up. Angela took a slow breath and leaned forward slightly. "I assure you, I purchased a first-class ticket. Could you double-check, please?" she asked, her voice still kind but steady. Another flight attendant joined in, glancing at Angela from head to toe before whispering something to her colleague. Both of them chuckled softly as though sharing an inside joke. One of them said in a slightly mocking tone, "First class is reserved for important passengers. Are you sure you're in the right place?" The words cut deeper than the tone. Angela didn't flinch, but she felt the sting of their assumptions. Her mind wandered briefly to all the times she had been underestimated in her career simply because of how she looked, dressed, or spoke. Still, she refused to let anger rise. Instead, she gave them the number again. "Here's my confirmation code," she said firmly. The attendants exchanged a glance, shrugged, and waved her off as if her presence was an inconvenience. "We don't see anything here," one of them said. "Either you sit in economy or you might miss your flight. It's up to you." Angela realized then that arguing further in front of so many strangers might not solve anything. She could see the line behind her growing. The last thing she wanted was to cause a scene. With quiet grace, she nodded and said, "Thank you for your time." She retrieved her phone and stepped aside. As she walked toward the economy boarding line, she noticed the subtle reactions around her. A few passengers gave her sympathetic looks, clearly recognizing she had been treated unfairly. Others avoided eye contact, perhaps uncomfortable with what they had just witnessed. Angela held her head high and kept walking, refusing to let humiliation bend her posture. She boarded the plane and found her seat in the economy section. Sliding into the narrow chair, she placed her bag under the seat in front of her and took a moment to breathe. She reminded herself that dignity wasn't tied to a seat, a title, or the judgment of others. She had worked far too hard in life to let two dismissive attendants shake her sense of worth. Yet deep down, she also knew something those attendants could never imagine. She wasn't just another traveler with a boarding pass. She wasn't simply a businesswoman on her way to a meeting. Angela Morris was the CEO of the very airline whose employees had just tried to humiliate her. She had chosen not to reveal her identity at the counter, preferring to watch and see how they treated her as an ordinary customer. Now, as the plane prepared for takeoff, Angela sat quietly, her thoughts steady. She could hear the attendants at the front laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the storm their behavior was about to bring. Angela smiled faintly, not out of cruelty, but with the calm understanding of someone who knew the truth would reveal itself in time. The hum of the engines grew louder as the aircraft began to roll down the runway. Passengers around her buckled in, some flipping through magazines, others closing their eyes for rest. Angela opened her laptop, not to work, but to prepare for what she knew she must do. She had given the crew a chance to treat her fairly, to uphold the values of respect and professionalism. They had failed. Soon, their actions would meet consequences far greater than they could imagine. For now, Angela remained still, her mind as composed as her posture. She would act when the right moment came, and when she did, everyone on board would understand who she truly was. Angela sat quietly in her narrow seat as the plane taxied toward the runway. Around her, passengers adjusted seat belts, tucked bags beneath their seats, and flipped through the airline magazine tucked in the pocket ahead of them. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to focus on her breathing. She had learned long ago that when others tried to belittle her, the strongest response was often silence. Yet, deep inside, she could not ignore the sting of humiliation she had just experienced at the boarding gate. The words of the attendants replayed in her mind, "First class is reserved for important passengers." They had spoken with such certainty, as if they could judge her value in a single glance. Angela knew she didn't fit their shallow image of wealth and power. She wasn't covered in flashy jewelry or designer clothing. Her simple style and calm demeanor often made people underestimate her. What they didn't know was that behind her quiet presence was a woman who made decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of passengers. As the plane lifted off the ground, Angela glanced around at the passengers sitting nearby. Some were busy with their phones, others were already asleep. A middle-aged couple across the aisle gave her a small nod, perhaps in sympathy for the way she had been treated earlier. One young woman even whispered to her, "I saw what happened back there. That wasn't right." Angela returned the kind smile and replied softly, "Thank you." The attendants who had dismissed her so harshly earlier were now moving down the aisle, performing the standard safety checks and serving water. Their cheerful tone with other passengers only made their earlier behavior more striking. Angela noticed how easily they could put on polite smiles for some travelers while withholding even basic respect for others. When one of them stopped near her row, their eyes met for a moment. The attendant quickly looked away, as though uncomfortable. Angela simply folded her hands in her lap and said nothing. She could feel the curiosity of those sitting nearby. Who was this woman that carried herself with such composure after being insulted? Some passengers must have expected her to make a scene, to argue loudly or demand justice on the spot. Instead, Angela chose dignity over drama. Still, whispers began to spread through the cabin. Passengers talked quietly among themselves about what they had witnessed. A man in the row behind Angela muttered to his seatmate, "She showed them her ticket, I saw it. They just didn't want to let her in." His companion shook his head. "Some people think they can judge others just by appearances." Angela's silence spoke louder than any outburst could have. But even in her calm, she could feel the weight of injustice pressing on her. She thought back to her younger years, when she had faced countless rejections while trying to climb the corporate ladder. Back then, she had been told in subtle and not so subtle ways that she didn't fit the image of leadership. Every insult, every dismissal, had only made her stronger. Tonight was no different. The humiliation reached its peak when another attendant approached Angela with a tray of drinks. Instead of offering with the same smile she gave to the passengers in first class, her tone was clipped. "Water or juice?" she asked. Angela chose water, thanking her politely, but the attendant walked away without acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, but it carried the same message as before: they did not see her as someone worthy of respect. Angela sipped her water slowly, her mind steady. She reminded herself that respect was not about a seat number or a uniform. It was about how people chose to treat one another when no one was watching. She thought of the values she instilled in her company: dignity, fairness, and humility. The crew's actions had violated those values in the most public way. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where first-class passengers were served warm towels and elegant meals. A curtain separated the sections, but the distance between her seat and theirs felt far greater. Yet Angela knew the truth: that curtain could not separate her from who she truly was. The attendants might not know it, but she was the very reason this plane was in the air, the reason their paychecks existed. Passengers around her seemed to sense that something was unusual about Angela. A young boy seated 2 rows ahead turned around more than once to look at her. His mother gently pulled him back, whispering something Angela couldn't hear, but Angela smiled softly at the child. She knew children could sense things that adults often ignored. The longer the flight went on, the more obvious the contrast became. The attendants continued to treat first-class passengers with extra care, while offering only the minimum attention to those in economy. Angela noticed every detail: the change in tone, the forced smiles, the way their body language shifted when dealing with different travelers. To her, it was a clear reminder of why leadership mattered. A true leader didn't measure people by appearances, but by their humanity. Still, Angela remained composed. She didn't let her emotions spill over into anger. She reminded herself that moments like these had a way of revealing truth. As much as the humiliation burned, she knew patience would allow the full picture to come into focus. Passengers continued whispering, and the story of what had happened at the gate grew in quiet waves across the cabin. Some were outraged on her behalf, others shook their heads in silence, but all agreed they had witnessed something deeply unfair. Angela didn't ask for their sympathy, but she felt their eyes on her, watching, waiting, wondering if she would respond. She took out her notebook from her bag and began to write. At first, it looked like she was jotting down random thoughts, but in truth, she was recording everything: the words the attendants had spoken, the tone they used, the way the situation unfolded. She was not doing it out of spite but out of responsibility. She knew that accountability mattered, and she was the one person with the power to ensure it. As the plane continued its journey through the darkening sky, Angela closed her notebook and placed it carefully back in her bag. She glanced out the window at the clouds below, her reflection faintly visible against the glass. She whispered quietly to herself, "Patience." The attendants believed they had succeeded in putting her in her place. They thought the curtain between first class and economy would keep the truth hidden. What they didn't know was that the real curtain was about to fall, and when it did, everyone on this flight would see Angela Morris for who she truly was. Angela remained calm in her seat as the plane cut through the night sky, but the mood around her began to shift. At first, the flight seemed ordinary, with passengers settling into their routines. Some were watching movies, others reading books, and many trying to sleep. But only an hour into the flight, small signs of trouble appeared. One of the attendants hurried down the aisle, her face pale as she whispered something urgently to another crew member. The two quickly disappeared behind the curtain separating first class from economy. Their voices were hushed, but the tension was clear. Angela, always observant, noticed the way they moved with nervous energy. Something was wrong, and the crew was struggling to manage it. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. His tone was steady, but Angela could hear a faint undercurrent of stress. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a minor technical issue. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. There is no need for concern, the crew is handling the matter. The announcement calmed some passengers, but not Angela. She could read situations better than most, and she knew the difference between routine turbulence and genuine concern. The hurried movements of the crew, the quick glances exchanged, and the way they avoided eye contact with passengers, all of it told her the problem was more serious than they were letting on. Within minutes, she overheard snippets of their whispers as they rushed past her row. Words like system error, authorization, and approval reached her ears. It didn't take long for Angela to piece things together. The crew needed to contact the airline's headquarters to resolve the issue. A technical adjustment required clearance from higher management. Angela sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She had been patient until now, enduring humiliation with grace. But patience did not mean powerlessness. She understood the gravity of what was unfolding, and she also knew she was the one person on board who could resolve the situation with a single message. The irony did not escape her. Just an hour earlier, these same attendants had dismissed her, refused to believe she belonged in first class, and treated her as if she were invisible. Now, without realizing it, they needed her more than anyone else on the flight. She slowly reached for her laptop bag under the seat. Passengers nearby glanced curiously as she opened the device, its glow illuminating her calm, focused face. With a few swift keystrokes, she connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi and composed a message addressed directly to the airline's executive board. Her words were precise, professional, and urgent. This is Angela Morris, CEO of our airline. I am currently on flight 271. The crew is facing a technical issue that requires immediate clearance. Please contact the captain and provide authorization to proceed with emergency measures. I expect a swift response. She pressed send, then closed her laptop with quiet confidence. While the crew scrambled in confusion, Angela had already reached the highest authority. 5 minutes later, her phone vibrated with a direct reply from the chairman of the board. We are on it, Angela. The captain will receive clearance within minutes. Thank you for alerting us. Angela leaned back in her seat, her expression serene. She did not need to boast, nor did she need to announce what she had done. The truth had a way of surfacing at the right time. She simply waited, calm amid the storm. Meanwhile, the attendants continued their frantic back and forth. Passengers began asking questions, their voices laced with concern. What's happening? One man asked. Is everything okay? A woman added. The attendants offered vague reassurances, but their nervousness betrayed them. Angela watched silently, her thoughts steady. She remembered the words they had spoken to her earlier, first class is reserved for important passengers. She thought about the irony that she was not just important, but the most important passenger on this flight. And yet, she carried herself not with arrogance, but with quiet dignity. The cabin buzzed with unease until, at last, the captain's voice returned over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We have received clearance from headquarters and will be proceeding safely. Please remain seated as we continue our journey. Relief spread among the passengers. Conversations resumed, and the tension slowly lifted. But Angela noticed the subtle change in the crew's behavior. They had realized something unusual had happened. The authorization had come too quickly, too directly, for it to be ordinary protocol. A senior officer entered the cabin, speaking quietly with the attendants. His eyes scanned the rows until they landed on Angela. He approached her seat with respectful composure, bending slightly to address her. Miss Morris, he said softly, thank you for your message. Headquarters informed us that you intervened. The captain sends his gratitude. Gasps rippled through the nearby passengers. Those who had overheard earlier whispers now pieced the truth together. The woman who had been dismissed, mocked, and forced into economy was not an ordinary traveler. She was the CEO of the very airline they were flying on. Angela gave the officer a polite nod and said, "I appreciate your acknowledgement. My only concern is the safety and dignity of everyone on this plane." The officer nodded again, his face serious, and returned to the front of the cabin. The attendants, now visibly shaken, avoided Angela's gaze. Their earlier smugness had evaporated. They whispered nervously to one another, realizing the depth of their mistake. Passengers around Angela exchanged astonished looks. Some leaned closer to one another, whispering, "Did you hear that? She's the CEO." Others simply stared at her with newfound respect. The young woman who had spoken to Angela earlier smiled with pride, as if witnessing justice unfold before her eyes. Angela, however, did not seek applause. She returned to her calm posture, folding her hands and gazing out the window at the stars beyond. She knew the flight was only halfway done, and the moment of true accountability had yet to come. For now, she was content to let the truth simmer among the passengers and the crew, preparing the stage for what was inevitable. The attendants who had once mocked her now realized their entire career hung in the balance. They had judged a woman by her appearance, not knowing they were dealing with their own employer. And while Angela did not raise her voice or demand instant punishment, they knew consequences were already on their way. Angela breathed deeply, her mind focused. She thought not just about her own dignity, but about the lesson this moment could offer. Respect should never depend on appearances, wealth, or titles. It should be given freely to every human being. And soon, this flight would become an unforgettable reminder of that truth. Angela sat with quiet grace as the plane sailed through the night sky. The earlier tension had not left the cabin, instead, it had transformed into something sharper, something more electric. Passengers were whispering in low voices, their curiosity now fixed on the woman in seat 14B who had suddenly been addressed with the kind of respect usually reserved for royalty. The attendants, once smug and dismissive, now moved stiffly, their polished smiles faltering every time their eyes strayed toward Angela. They knew the truth now, or at least enough of it to feel the weight of dread in their stomachs. Angela, however, remained composed. She was not a woman who celebrated revenge. She had spent her entire life fighting battles without raising her voice, using her intelligence, her patience, and her authority in ways that left lasting marks. Tonight would be no different. The senior officer, who had come earlier to thank her, returned to her row once again. His voice was low, respectful, and deliberate. "Miss Morris, the captain has requested that you join him briefly in the front cabin once we reach cruising altitude. He would like to express his gratitude personally." Angela gave him a polite nod. "Tell him I appreciate the courtesy. I will come." Minutes later, she was escorted forward. The curtain that had separated first class from the rest of the plane was pulled aside, and for the first time, the passengers saw her step into the space that had been denied to her at boarding. Gasps and murmurs followed, but Angela ignored them, her focus steady. She entered the cockpit area quietly, where the captain stood waiting. The captain, a seasoned man with decades of flying experience, removed his cap and inclined his head respectfully. "Miss Morris," he said sincerely, "I cannot tell you how grateful I am. Without your swift action, we might have faced delays or worse. You handled this situation with extraordinary composure. Thank you for protecting not just this crew, but every passenger on board." Angela smiled faintly, her tone measured. "It was my duty, Captain. As CEO, I carry responsibility not only for our planes but for the people who place their trust in us. Tonight reminded me how important it is for that trust to be respected on every level." The captain nodded gravely. "I assure you, your words will be remembered. I regret deeply the treatment you endured before boarding. It does not reflect the standards we uphold." Angelo met his eyes firmly. "And yet, it happened. Those who represent our airline are the face of our values. Their actions matter as much as your skill in flying this plane. A plane can be flawless mechanically, but if its crew fails in dignity, it fails the brand entirely. The captain lowered his head, understanding the weight of her words. Angela excused herself politely and returned to the cabin, but not before sending a simple message with her expression alone. Leadership was not about anger, it was about principle. When she was escorted back to her seat, she no longer belonged in economy. The officer gestured toward a freshly prepared first-class seat waiting for her. Passengers craned their necks to watch as she gracefully accepted the move. She did not gloat, nor did she glance back in triumph. She simply sat, opened her notebook, and resumed writing. The attendants who had insulted her earlier stood frozen at the side of the aisle. Their earlier arrogance had melted into fear. Their hands fidgeted with serving trays, their faces flushed. Every polite word they now spoke to other passengers carried the heaviness of guilt. They were living the nightmare of realizing they had mocked their employer in public. Passengers in first class exchanged curious looks as Angela settled in. Some whispered to one another, "She's the CEO." Others simply stared in awe. A few bold passengers even leaned closer to her seat and offered quiet words of admiration. One older gentleman said softly, "I saw what happened earlier. The way you handled it, remarkable." Angela smiled warmly at him. "Thank you. Sometimes the best response is patience." Meanwhile, whispers continued throughout the plane. Those who had witnessed her humiliation earlier were now piecing the story together with satisfaction. A woman in row 12 told her husband in a hushed voice, they didn't know who they were talking to. "She's the one who runs the whole airline." The husband shook his head, amazed. "They're in serious trouble now." Angela remained silent, but her very presence was enough to send ripples of realization across the cabin. For the attendants, every step they took now felt heavier, every glance more suffocating. They avoided her eyes, but their avoidance was louder than words. As the flight stretched onward, Angela used the time to reflect. She thought about the values she had fought to establish in her company: fairness, humility, and equality. Tonight was a living test of those values. If attendants could treat her with such disrespect, how were they treating other passengers who lacked the power to respond? That thought weighed on her more than her personal humiliation. It wasn't about her pride, it was about the system. She knew that when this plane landed, she would act decisively. Not out of spite, but out of duty. Her responsibility was larger than herself. It was to every passenger who deserved dignity, to every employee who understood that respect should not depend on appearance, and to every young professional watching her example. The passengers sensed it too, that something significant was unfolding before their eyes. A quiet tension filled the air, as though everyone was waiting for the curtain to rise on the final act of a play. They knew the story was not finished. Angela closed her notebook once more and glanced toward the front of the cabin. The crew members were huddled together, whispering nervously. She knew they were discussing what would happen next. For them, the next few hours would feel like an eternity. For Angela, it was simply a matter of time. As the engines hummed steadily and the plane moved closer to its destination, Angela allowed herself a small smile. The truth had been revealed. The mask had fallen. Now, accountability would follow, and the lesson of respect would be carved into the memory of every person who had witnessed this flight. When the wheels of the plane touched the runway, a soft jolt ran through the cabin. Passengers stirred awake, some stretching, some fastening their belts tighter as the announcement of arrival played overhead. For most travelers, this was an ordinary landing. For Angela Morris, it was the quiet moment before everything changed. The attendants moved down the aisles, instructing passengers to remain seated until the plane came to a complete stop. Their voices trembled ever so slightly, betraying the storm of nerves inside them. They had spent the last hours in silence, avoiding Angela's gaze, but now they could no longer avoid the truth. They knew who she was, and they knew what was waiting at the gate. Angela sat in her first-class seat, calm as ever, her notebook closed neatly on her lap. She had not raised her voice once throughout the flight, yet her presence carried more weight than any outburst could have. The passengers around her were alert, sensing that the story they had witnessed was far from over. The plane rolled slowly toward the terminal, engines humming low. Through the window, Angela could see ground staff waiting near the gate. She recognized two senior officers from her headquarters standing with stern expressions. They weren't there for a routine greeting, they were there because she had called, and her word was never ignored. As the doors opened, the crew lined up to thank passengers as usual, but their smiles were forced, their hands cold. When Angela stood and walked forward, the murmur of whispers followed her. Some passengers even applauded softly, not for the landing, but for the quiet strength she had shown. Angela offered them a modest nod before stepping into the jet bridge. The senior officers greeted her first. "Miss Morris," one said respectfully, "we received your report. We are here to follow your instructions." Angela's voice was steady. "Thank you. Please ensure the passengers disembark smoothly. Once they do, I want a private meeting with the crew." The officers nodded. The passengers filed out one by one, many casting curious glances back at Angela. Some mouthed words of encouragement, others shook their heads in disbelief at what they had seen. One woman paused just long enough to whisper, "You handled it with such grace." Angela simply replied, "Everyone deserves dignity." When the last passenger had left, the jet bridge grew silent. The attendants stood in a small group near the galley, their faces pale, their posture nervous. They had gone from confident and dismissive to fearful and uncertain. None of them dared to speak first. Angela stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She did not shout, nor did she scowl. She simply looked at them, one by one, with calm authority. Finally, she spoke. "When I approached you at the gate," she began, her tone even, "I gave you a chance to do your job with fairness. I showed you my ticket, I asked politely, and I expected nothing more than the respect every passenger deserves. Instead, I was dismissed, mocked, and told that first class was for important passengers." The attendants lowered their heads, shame washing over them. Angela continued, her words sharp but measured. "What you did was not simply poor service. It was a violation of the very values this airline was built upon. Our brand stands for safety, respect, and dignity. You chose arrogance over service. You chose judgment over humility." One attendant stammered, we didn't know who you were." Angela's eyes narrowed slightly, though her tone remained calm. "And that is exactly the problem. Respect should not depend on who a person is. You should not treat someone differently because of their clothes, their background, or your assumptions. Every passenger is important." Silence filled the air. The attendants shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence gone. They knew there was no excuse. Angela turned to the senior officers. "Effective immediately, these crew members are relieved of duty. Their behavior is unacceptable and cannot be tolerated in our airline." The officers stepped forward, nodding. The attendants gasped quietly, but none of them protested. They knew the truth, they had sealed their own fate with their actions. Angela looked at them one final time. "I hope this moment teaches you something valuable. Humility is not weakness. Respect is not optional. The way you treat people defines you more than your title or your uniform. Remember that lesson in whatever path you choose next." With that, she turned and walked away, her posture tall, her presence unshaken. The officers escorted the attendants out, their footsteps heavy with regret. Outside the gate, more staff members stood waiting. News of what had happened on the flight had already begun to spread. They greeted Angela with deep respect, some bowing their heads, others standing straighter in her presence. She simply nodded, moving through them with the quiet confidence of a leader who knew her worth. By the time she reached the car waiting to take her to her hotel, her phone was buzzing with notifications. Word of the incident was already moving across social media. Passengers who had been on the flight shared what they had seen, how a woman had been denied her rightful seat, how she had remained calm, how she had later revealed herself to be the CEO, and how justice had been delivered swiftly. Angela read a few of the posts. "Respect everyone, you never know who they are," one passenger had written. Another wrote, "The most powerful person on the plane was also the most humble. A lesson for us all." She closed her phone, a faint smile on her lips. It wasn't about the attention or the headlines. For Angela, it was about the principle. She wanted her company, her employees, and the world to understand that true leadership was not about status or wealth, it was about values. As the car drove her away from the airport, she gazed out the window at the city lights twinkling in the distance. She thought about the meeting she had tomorrow, about the future of her airline, and about the countless passengers who would step onto planes in the days ahead. They might not know her name, but they would feel her influence in the way they were treated. And that was enough. Angela leaned back in her seat, calm and at peace. The humiliation she had endured hours earlier had turned into a powerful lesson, not just for the crew, but for everyone who witnessed it. She had shown that dignity and patience could be stronger than arrogance and pride. She had shown that true power does not need to shout. And above all, she had reminded the world of a simple truth: respect should never be reserved for a chosen few. It belongs to everyone.